I always knew something was off about my childhood, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I was raised by my Aunt Linda and Uncle Marcus in a quiet suburb outside of Chicago. They weren't affectionate, but they weren't cruel either. They paid the bills, fed me, and made sure I had what I needed. Still, there was a distance, like I was a long-term guest in a house that never really felt like home. They told me my parents had died in a car crash when I was a baby. No photos, no graves, no family mementos. Just one framed picture of a smiling couple they claimed were my mother and father. I used to stare at that photo and wonder why their faces felt like strangers. Things stayed quiet until I turned 25. It started with a Facebook message from someone named Rachel. I didn't recognize the name, but the message stopped my heart cold. "You don't know me, but I think we might be sisters. I found a birth certificate with your name on it, and it lists my mother as yours too." I stared at the screen for a long time, my mind racing. I thought it had to be some kind of scam. But Rachel sent me a photo of the birth certificate. There it was. My full name, my birth date, and the mother's name wasn't Linda. It was Margaret L. Hale, Rachel's mom. It didn't make sense. Why would Linda and Marcus lie? Why would they raise me and pretend my parents were dead? Unless they weren't. Unless I was never supposed to know. I started asking questions, digging through old documents, and what I found flipped my world upside down. Not only were my parents alive, they had chosen to erase me. And the reason? I wasn't part of the picture-perfect life they wanted to show the world. I wasn't a miracle child. I was a mistake, a secret. But they were about to find out what happens when a secret learns to speak. I grew up thinking I was an orphan. Linda and Marcus told me my parents had died when I was just a few months old. A drunk driver? No survivors? I asked questions like most kids do. Who were they? What did they do? But the answers were always vague. They were kind, good people, Linda would say, then quickly change the subject. We didn't have family photos, keepsakes, or relatives who visited. Holidays were quiet, birthdays were forgettable. Still, I had no reason to doubt them. They provided for me in their own emotionally distant way. I had clothes, food, and a roof over my head. But love? Warmth? That was always in short supply. They weren't cruel, just cold. Like they were fulfilling an obligation, not raising a child. School was my sanctuary. I excelled in every subject, and I poured myself into extracurriculars, art club, yearbook committee, anything that got me out of the house. Teachers praised me for being focused and independent. But inside, I was lonely. There was always this nagging feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. Like I had been left behind before I was even old enough to understand what that meant. I remember one incident clearly. I was 10 years old and had drawn a picture for Mother's Day. It was of a woman with dark hair holding a baby. I don't know why, but I didn't draw Linda. I drew someone else, someone warmer, softer. When I handed it to her, Linda barely looked at it. "That's nice," she said flatly, and put it in a drawer. She never hung it up. I found it years later, crumpled in the back of her file cabinet. It wasn't until I was in college that I started feeling more curious about my family history. Every time I asked Linda or Marcus for my birth certificate or old records, even for applying for a passport, they found excuses. "We'll have to dig those up," they'd say. "They're in storage." It was frustrating, but I was too caught up in surviving school and part-time jobs to push. After college, I moved into a small apartment in the city and started working as a digital archivist for a historical nonprofit. I was surrounded by people preserving their family's stories while I had none of my own. I even started scanning and restoring photos for strangers, watching as their histories came to life. And all the while, I had a blank page for a past. When Rachel messaged me, I didn't believe her at first. I ignored the message for 2 days, but the curiosity, the need and to know was stronger than the fear. I wrote back cautiously, "What makes you think we're sisters?" She replied with 3 photos. One of her as a child, one of her mom, Margaret, holding a baby, and one of a birthday party from the early 2000s. My face was in the background. I was maybe 3 or 4, and standing next to me, smiling, was a woman who looked eerily familiar, someone I had never seen before in my memory, but whose eyes looked just like mine. Rachel and I started talking regularly. She told me everything she knew, that her mom had been a single mother in her early 20s, had gotten involved with a married man, and had a scandal baby. That baby, me, was apparently sent to live with a relative to avoid embarrassment and social judgment. No one ever mentioned me again. Margaret went on to marry someone else and had Rachel. "I always felt like there was a shadow," Rachel said on one call. "Mom was loving, but there were secrets she wouldn't share. Now I think that shadow was you." The more we uncovered, the worse it got. Linda, it turned out, wasn't just some distant cousin. She was Margaret's older sister. My uncle Marcus wasn't related at all. They had been paid, yes, paid to raise me and keep quiet. There were bank transfers, all carefully masked as family support, sent from Margaret's husband's law firm over the years, every few months. Like I was some arrangement that needed regular maintenance. It was never about care, it was about containment. And the story about my parents dying in a car crash? Completely fabricated. They had staged an entire false narrative to keep me silent, hidden, and legally separate from Margaret's new life. She lived 2 cities over, had a perfect house, a perfect husband, a perfect daughter, and no trace of me. Until now. Once I knew the truth, I couldn't unsee it. Every quiet moment of my childhood, every cold response from Linda, every excuse for why there were no pictures of my real parents, they all snapped into place like pieces of a cruel puzzle. I wasn't grieving lost parents anymore. I was grieving a stolen identity. Rachel and I dug deeper together. She was just as shaken as I was. To her credit, she didn't brush me off or try to minimize what Margaret had done. In fact, she seemed angry on my behalf. But anger wasn't enough. I needed answers. I tried to reach out to Margaret directly. I started with a letter, a handwritten note I dropped in her mailbox late at night, unsigned but unmistakably clear. "You know who I am. I know the truth now. I deserve to hear it from you." I waited a week. Nothing. Then I tried calling her office. She was still working as a consultant for nonprofits. Her assistant told me she was out of the country for the next 2 months. That was a lie. Rachel confirmed she was home, just avoiding me. I considered showing up at her house, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed to know what I was walking into. So I focused on the paper trail. It turned out Margaret had gone to great lengths to erase me, not legally, but socially. My birth certificate had been altered. It listed unknown for the father, and Linda Hale as my legal guardian. No court adoption, no official foster paperwork. Just a quiet transfer of custody, assisted by a family lawyer who clearly knew how to bury inconvenient truths. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing it got. A private email from Rachel showed that Margaret once told her therapist that she had given up her first child under pressure, but felt relieved to have moved on. I wasn't a tragedy to her. I was an inconvenience she had outsourced. Meanwhile, Linda and Marcus maintained their silence. When I confronted them with what I knew, Linda simply said, "We did what we had to do. It was complicated. Let it go." Let it go? I was 25 years old, and my entire life had been orchestrated by people who saw me as a secret to be managed, not a person to be loved. What hurt more was realizing that there had been birthday parties, vacations, family photos. Margaret had built a beautiful life, one I had never been allowed to be part of. And she did it while pretending I didn't exist. But Rachel had. Rachel had grown up in that house. Rachel had called her mom every day. And Rachel, now racked with guilt and disbelief, was the only one willing to be honest with me. One night, while sitting in my dark apartment, I looked at an old picture Rachel had sent, her 10th birthday. There were balloons, a cake, a big backyard. Margaret was in the photo, beaming with pride, her arms around Rachel. I zoomed in on the background. There was a photo frame on the wall, a family collage. My stomach dropped. One of the photos inside the frame was of me, a toddler, in a yellow dress I remembered hating, standing next to a woman I now knew was Margaret. They had kept a photo of me, in plain view. I was part of her life, just long enough to become inconvenient. I knew then that I couldn't move on quietly. I wasn't going to be swept back under the rug. If they wanted me to stay hidden, they had miscalculated. Because now I was going to step into the light and make sure the truth was seen by everyone who had helped bury it. Revenge, for me, wasn't about shouting from the rooftops or burning bridges in public. It wasn't even about humiliation, at least not at first. It was about truth, exposure, control. For the first time in my life, I wanted control over the story that had been stolen from me. Rachel and I met at a cafe downtown one afternoon. She slid a manila folder across the table. No words, just a tight, apologetic smile. Inside were copies of emails between Margaret and Linda spanning over 2 decades, discussions about money, payments for expenses, passive-aggressive arguments about keeping boundaries. The most damning email was dated 6 months after I was born. I'm trusting you with this. If anyone ever finds out it's over for me, make sure she knows nothing. I stared at that sentence until my vision blurred. It wasn't just proof. It was intent. Rachel looked at me carefully. What do you want to do with all of this? My answer came quickly. I want her to live in fear of exposure, just like I lived in fear of abandonment. And so, I built a plan. Step 1 was legal. I contacted a family law attorney and had my original birth certificate pulled from county records. With Rachel's help, I found the original hospital record and the paperwork Margaret had used to pass custody to Linda without court involvement. That lack of due process? Highly questionable. Possibly illegal. Definitely reputationally damaging. Step 2 was personal. I compiled a digital folder titled Margaret's Shadow, scans of documents, emails, photos, and a timeline of events. Then I made 3 USB copies. One I kept, one I sent anonymously to Margaret's employer, a nonprofit that specialized in family reunification services. The third? I mailed to Margaret herself. No letter, no note, just the flash drive in a small black box. Step 3 was public, but subtle. I started a blog, anonymous but carefully written. I shared my story under the name Forgotten Daughter. I changed names, dates, and places, but the emotional truth was raw and intact. Within weeks, the blog had thousands of views. Comments poured in from people who said they'd experienced the same, being hidden, denied, disowned. I wasn't just telling my story anymore. I was giving a voice to others who had been erased. I never mentioned Margaret by name, but people who knew. Step 4? That was for Linda. I knew she volunteered at the local church as a mentor for young mothers, so I requested to speak at one of their monthly events. under the guise of being a speaker from a local organization that supported women who had survived family betrayal. She didn't recognize me right away when I walked onto the stage, but when I started speaking, when I told the story of a little girl passed off to relatives like a shameful secret, raised in coldness, kept from her real identity, Linda's face turned to stone. I didn't point her out. I didn't need to. The silence in the room did the work for me. Afterward, I left a single envelope at the front desk with her name on it. Inside was a photo, the same one Rachel had shown me. Me, as a toddler, in the background of their family photo collage. On the back, I had written just 5 words. "You don't own this anymore." That was when the cracks started to show. Margaret resigned from her nonprofit board 3 weeks later, officially for health reasons. Unofficially, she was drowning in whispers and suspicion. Rachel told me she'd gone quiet, panicked, and when she finally confronted Margaret about it face to face, Margaret said, "I don't know how she found all this." Rachel simply replied, "She was always going to find it. You just hoped she wouldn't survive it." But I had survived, and now they would all live knowing I was no longer their secret. It all came to a head on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that looks peaceful from the outside, while everything underneath begins to unravel. Rachel called me. Her voice was shaky. "She's here, at my apartment." I froze. "Margaret?" "Yes, she showed up unannounced. She's sitting in my living room. She says she wants to clear the air." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't ready. I had imagined confronting her 100 times, in courtrooms, on doorsteps, in public showdowns, but I never expected her to come to us. Rachel lowered her voice. "She said she'll leave if you don't want to see her, but I think you should." 20 minutes later, I walked into Rachel's apartment. Margaret was sitting on the couch, legs crossed, hands folded neatly on her lap like she was waiting for a job interview. She looked smaller than I remembered in the pictures. Her hair was perfectly styled. Her pearl earrings were in place. She looked like a woman who had built a pristine life and was terrified it was slipping through her fingers. She stood up when she saw me. "You look just like—" I cut her off. "Don't." She sat back down. For a moment, we just stared at each other. There was no warmth in the room, no sense of reunion, just air thick with things unsaid. Then she began. "I made mistakes. I was young. I was scared. My parents were ashamed, and I didn't have the strength to say no. They said if I kept you, I'd ruin everything, and I believed them." I said nothing. I wanted to hear it all. "I thought Linda could give you a better life. She didn't want children, but Marcus had just lost his job, and the money helped. I paid them every month. I checked in. I asked for updates." "You paid them to disappear me," I said coldly. She flinched. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did." Margaret's voice cracked. "I built a life where I thought no one would ever find out, and then you did. And I realized I'd spent 25 years pretending the worst thing I ever did didn't exist. That thing is me." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't offer her comfort. She looked at Rachel. "You told her everything?" Rachel nodded without hesitation. "She deserved to know." Margaret turned back to me. "I came here because I want to make it right." I leaned forward. "You can't make it right, but you can admit what you did, not just to me, to everyone. You want peace? Tell the truth." Her face crumbled. "What would that fix?" "It won't fix the past," I said, "but it will prove that I'm not ashamed to exist, and neither should you be ashamed to admit that you lied." She didn't answer right away, just nodded slowly, wiping her cheek with the back of her manicured hand. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll talk to the board and to the family." "I'm not asking," I replied. "I'm giving you a chance to walk out of this with dignity. Don't waste it." That was the moment everything shifted. She stood up, defeated, no longer the composed, calculating woman in control, just a mother who had run out of places to hide her guilt. She walked out of the apartment in silence, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left behind. Margaret didn't make a grand announcement, but she didn't hide any more either. 2 weeks after our confrontation, she resigned from the last nonprofit board she sat on, not citing health reasons this time, but releasing a quiet, formal statement through the organization. "It's important to take accountability for personal choices that may have caused harm. I am stepping down to reflect and take responsibility." No details, no names, but to the people who knew, it was enough. The whispers stopped being whispers. Her reputation took a hit, not because I destroyed it, but because the truth had simply been held up to the light. A few of Margaret's old colleagues reached out to Rachel, some out of concern, some out of curiosity. Rachel never defended Margaret. She simply told them, "I'm supporting my sister." That word, sister, still startled me the first few times I heard it, but in the weeks that followed, it began to feel real. Rachel and I started spending more time together, coffee, errands, even visiting our childhood neighborhood just to see what memories we could recover. We were both missing pieces, but together it didn't feel as hollow. There was laughter, shared sarcasm, little fights over music playlists. We were building something honest, not born of blood, but of choice. As for Linda and Marcus, they vanished from my life entirely. I never got another call, letter, or knock on the door. That silence used to scare me. Now it felt like peace. I kept the blog going, but shifted the focus. I wrote less about the wound and more about the healing, about learning to define your own story, even when someone else tried to write the first chapter without your consent. Survivors from all over began sharing their stories. I wasn't alone. I was part of something bigger, a quiet rebellion against being erased. One afternoon I received a letter in the mail, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a note from Margaret, no dramatic language, no plea for forgiveness, just 3 simple lines. "You were never a mistake. I'm sorry I let others convince me otherwise. I hope you live freely now, and loudly." No signature, just those words. I sat with that letter for a long time. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I just accepted it. Because the apology wasn't for her. It was for me. And I finally had the power to decide what came next. I tucked it into a drawer. Not to forget, but because I didn't need to carry it anymore. For the first time, my past wasn't a prison. It was just part of the path I had walked to become someone whole. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, in layers, like peeling back an old bandage and letting air finally touch the wound. There were still hard days, days when I'd wake up and feel the weight of everything I'd missed, birthdays uncelebrated, childhood photos never taken, a mother's hug that never came when I needed it most. There were mornings when the silence in my apartment felt like a reminder of all the noise I grew up without, the kind that comes from belonging. But more and more, those moments became echoes, not anchors. I started creating rituals for myself. On my birthday, instead of mourning what was lost, I booked a solo trip to the mountains. I hiked alone, sat on cliffs, wrote in a journal. I looked at the sky and whispered, "You're allowed to exist. You always were." That became my truth. Rachel and I became family in the most honest sense. Not because we shared a parent, but because we chose to keep showing up for each other. She never pushed me to forgive Margaret. She never told me to move on faster. She simply listened, and sometimes that was enough. One night we went through a box of her old home videos. In one of them, Margaret is filming Rachel blowing out candles. The camera pans briefly, and there I am, sitting at the edge of the frame, small and unsure, eating cake with both hands. "I always wondered who that kid was," Rachel whispered. "Now I know." We laughed, cried a little. But more than anything, we let the moment be what it was. A glimpse of the truth that had always been hidden, now finally in focus. I framed a still from that video and put it on my shelf. Not because it made up for everything, but because it proved I had been there. I had existed, even when they tried to pretend I hadn't. I began speaking at youth shelters, sharing my story with teens who felt abandoned or invisible. I told them, "You are not your silence. You're not their shame. You get to rewrite the ending." And I meant it. Years from now, maybe Margaret will try again. Maybe there will be another letter, maybe not. But I'm no longer waiting for her love to feel complete. I've learned that some people only love you in theory, and that's their burden, not yours. As for me, I'm not a shadow anymore. I'm not a secret tucked away in someone else's story. I am my own beginning, and I am finally, completely seen.